Welcome to the final session in our 8-part series, The Holocaust as an Interdisciplinary Tapestry, where we've explored the multifaceted discipline of Holocaust studies through unique and previously unexplored lenses. Today's event will feature memory studies, museums, and memorials with Miriam Zadoff. As we convene today, it is with heavy hearts that we express our deepest concerns for the ever-evolving dynamics in the war in Israel. It has been almost 6 weeks since the outbreak of war. Collectively, we grieve for the loss of life and pray for peace. For those of you that may be new to our community, I'm Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. At Classrooms Without Borders, our mission transcends traditional boundaries of education, striving to combat anti-Semitism, genocide, and hate through the transformative power of learning, diversity, inclusion, and respect. We extend our sincere gratitude for the enduring support over the past 3 years. We have conducted an impressive 472 virtual programs with over 77,000 participants from nearly 60 countries, spanning 46 of the United States. As we gather together to dive into the rich tapestry of Holocaust studies, we invite you to contribute to our mission by making a donation. A link will be provided in the chat for you in just a moment. Classrooms Without Borders, in coordination with Tali Nates, founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Maydeen Shahar, director of Talking Memory online lecture series and international educational programs at the Ghetto Fighters House, Esther Topurik Finder, member of the GSI Coordinating Council, Generations of the Shoah, and in partnership with Liberation 75, welcomes you here today. Our event would not be possible without the dedicated involvement of Tali Nates, the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Tali is a historian whose lectures span the globe, focusing on Holocaust and genocide education, memory, reconciliation, and human rights. Her personal connection to the Holocaust, with her father and uncle being saved by Oskar Schindler, adds a deeply personal dimension to her work. Tali has been involved in the creation and production of numerous documentary films, authored articles, and contributed to various books that illuminate the importance of Holocaust remembrance, education, and combating anti-Semitism. It is great to have Tali here with us tonight, but due to unforeseen circumstances, Tali met this morning with Miriam to record her presentation. We are going to move directly to the recording, and then we will drop Miriam's extensive bio into the chat for you today. We also will be fielding questions as we always do, so please send them directly to me, Ellen Resnick, in the chat. We will collect these, and if Tali can answer them at the end of the presentation, she will do so. For the others, we will send them to Miriam and follow up with her responses. And with that, Erica, we can transition to the video.
Welcome, Miriam, dear Miriam Zadoff, to this conversation, the last of our series on the tapestry of putting different fields together with the Holocaust and how does it all happen. And you are really the most wonderful person to end this series with, because you are a combination of an academic that was, in universities, but also a practitioner, a director of the Munich Documentation Center of National Socialism, and you bring together this field of museums, memorials, memory, but also study of the Holocaust. And I wanted, please, to warmly welcome you and to ask you, please, will you introduce yourself and tell us, who is Miriam Zadoff?
Thank you so much, Tali, for having me. It's a big honor. I'm very happy to be part of this program and the final event, and to give me the opportunity to, because this is something one rarely does, to kind of like think together all the different aspects and fields of work one has been, doing throughout one's life. My background is I started as a researcher of Jewish studies, and actually I started with Holocaust studies. I studied in Vienna and then in Munich. I did my PhD in Munich and my second book. and then was offered a position at in Bloomington at Indiana University in Jewish Studies and History. And throughout this period of time, I have been writing a couple of books, either dealing with Holocaust studies, with, for example, the process of Aryanization, of the dispossession of Jewish property, but also with the history of the ghetto in Vilnius and the cultural production under National Socialism in the ghetto. And then I wrote a monography, a book on spas as Jewish spaces in the late 19th and early 20th century, phenomenon which was often overlooked, and I found it quite interesting because lots of Jews throughout Europe, different political backgrounds, would spend the summer in a spa, and not only the bourgeois representatives such as Sigmund Freud or many others, or intellectuals, but even someone like Karl Marx would go to a spa and then meet with a lot of different political and cultural Jewish representatives, because there were no explicitly Jewish spaces, or hardly any explicitly Jewish spaces throughout Europe, apart from Jewish living quarters, and so these would be international points of meeting for a specific part of time. After that, I wrote a biography of someone who had been extremely famous for some point in history, but then was completely forgotten. And this is Gershom Scholem's elder brother, Werner Scholem, a communist leader, early communism until Stalinism had influence on German communism, and I wrote about him in the perspective also sort of like of a Jewish perspective, but also of someone who had a very ambivalent attitude towards his own Judaism, but who died as a Jew in a concentration camp. And it's also a reflection on leftist Jewish perspectives, which is still quite relevant, or again quite relevant today. And in 2018, I moved back from the States to Europe and became director of a center which opened in 2015. This is the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism, a latecomer to the field of museums on National Socialism in Germany. We're not a Holocaust museum, but a museum that asked the question, how come Munich became the birthplace of the National Socialist movement, who supported it? Why was it exactly Munich that Hitler could flourish here? We're now looking at 100 years of the Hitler Putsch, the coup d'etat in 1923, the first attempted coup of National Socialists, the first attack on German democracy, and then 90 years of the beginning of National Socialism as a political sort of like for the regime, the National Socialist regime. And this is a museum in the center of Munich, and I will share my presentation so you have a little bit of insight to that.
Absolutely. And Miriam, it's just so fascinating to hear you speak about your career, your amazing academic career. And I'm just thinking, the connections to so many of us that are listening. You're talking about spas and the Jews. My mother's aunt was managing a spa resort in Otwock, Poland. And my father grew up near Zakopane. So, all the spas and the summers and the winters in Zakopane. So what I love hearing about your combination of academia, and now as you will introduce to our listeners, the special center, as you said, 100 years to the putsch in Munich, I think that you are standing in a very special position to say, how do we bring all those histories together? those that are told and those that are not so much investigated and told. So please do share with us a little bit about the center that you are the director of.
Thank you, Tali. Before I do that, I just want to answer to what you said now, because this was one of the interesting experiences I made when I did this spa project, is that a lot of people would say, like, well, this is a very, specific topic, Jews and spas. But then again, if you talk to anyone who has their roots in Europe, everybody would say, oh, my grandfather used to go too. Oh, and this is where, and it was interesting because, secular Berlin Jews would meet, for example, Hasidic Jews, who would also come to Karlsbad or to Karlovy Vary or Marienbad, and they would talk about each other. They would even go to each other's restaurants. So it was at one, on one hand, these were places where there was also a lot of anti-Semitism because there were so many Jews and Jewish perspectives found together. But they were also, in that sense, Jewish spaces that, one would be sort of on a very close space for a temporary time. One would be really next to each other's cousin from a very different background. And that for me was an interesting experience. And it was interesting in the sense also sort of like, coming to the center here and I work here, is that I come as someone who has a perspective of Jewish studies and Holocaust studies also from a Jewish perspective, coming to a center which has a little different outlook. Because when I first did Holocaust studies in the 1990s in Austria and Germany, I was rather frustrated that there was always the point of view of the perpetrator at that time. And if you would work on or focus on the documents, the sources, the voices of the groups that were being persecuted, in my case, it was mostly the Jewish perspective, but not only. I would often hear, but this is not objective. This is very subjective. This is a one-sided point of view, because at that point in Germany, at least, what was being done in America and in Israel was read, but there was a dispute about it. And the permanent exhibition at our center is very much focused on this German perspective. So the point of the victim groups is very marginal. We try to work against that by including it through temporary exhibitions, but it is an ongoing conversation. But I show you a little bit more what I talk about.
Absolutely.
So everybody has an idea of how this,
because you do really special
looks.
stuff.
Yeah, so let me just see. So I share the right screen. Yes, there we are. Okay, here we go. So you see here in this image, you see our center when it was opened in 2015 looks a little bit different now, a little greener, a little wilder. But you see, it's a new building. It's on the space where the Brown House used to be. The Brown House was the first Nazi party headquarters. It was a palais from the 19th century that was acquired by the Nazi party in 1930. And after that, this whole area of Munich became the center of the ideological center of the party. So even when Hitler and his disciples and his sort of like government moved to Berlin in 1933, this was still symbolically a very important space. And you can see the building on the left is one of the buildings that the Nazis then realized. There were a couple of others in trying to turn Munich into also sort of aesthetically into the capital of the movement. And I show you how it used to look like. You can see, I just go briefly back. The building on the left, like in the left upper corner that you see here, is the building here on the left. And you can see that this there were these two temples of honor that you see in the center of this image that were then realized in memory of the victims, but not the victims, but the people who died in the Hitler Putsch, the first spaces of memory that the regime built for itself. And this whole square, this whole area was used for rallies. And the building you see behind the left temple is the Brown House. This is where we are right now. The Brown House was then destroyed in the war, and for a long period of time, Munich did not know what to do with this space. And then in 2000, and that was a result, of course, of German unification, when Berlin turned into a big space of memory. Also in Munich, the city government said, okay, we have to do something. This is when the idea came to do the center. There were basically, you know, citizens, people living here in Munich who demanded that kind of center, that kind of a museum. And then it was realized. And you see here a little bit our permanent exhibition, which does not have any objects. This was deliberately decided not to have objects at that point in time, because, you know, the historians involved were afraid that maybe objects would also bring in a sort of right-wing neo-Nazi groups who would look for any remnants of the regime here. And you can see that the exhibition is very much sort of based on transferring knowledge, which I think on one hand, it's one of the weaknesses, because there is too much information. At the same time, you know, in a post-factual era that we live in, it's also good for us. We use it sort of as the backdrop for educational formats, but we have to work with this exhibition. If we would only focus on sort of like, if we send, you know, 15-year-olds into this exhibition, they get overwhelmed very quickly. Here are just some images. You can see people moving through the exhibition, and there's of course also an educational center, a library. There are also digital formats that we work with. And then more recently, we have started also working more and more with artists in our educational program. So we do workshops with artists, with comic artists, but we also use art and in the exhibition. Why do we use contemporary art? How did this come about? I think it's maybe seen, or sort of like, it's unusual that we took this decision, and it was one of the reasons was because when I started working here, I had a permanent exhibition, which I wanted to leave also. It was rather new. Although I would have done it differently, I much appreciate all the work that has been realized and all that the exhibition can give us. But I wanted to add something. And one of the big questions that we are all asking ourselves in these institutions, you know, since many years now, is what happens when the survivors are gone, when there are no survivors anymore telling their stories. We have been, you know, trying to highlight their stories. We have been trying to also use the history of the survivor. How did the survivor come about? We did an exhibition on that, and using this exhibition as a framework to bring in also videos from the 1980s, from the 1990s, also sort of like the history of the survivors, what they had contributed in, you know, because the work they had been doing is amazing. It's kind of like telling your own painful story of a violence that doesn't make any sense, but putting it into a narrative, and by that sort of giving us a story that does make sense, because it looks to a hopeful future. It says like, okay, this is the fight for democracy. This is why we're doing this work. So it does give us many tools for education, for this pro-democracy work, for, you know, remembering the Holocaust, remembering Nazi genocides. But they did this whole work, you know, by exposing themselves to, at first, to critique or to not being heard, or, you know, just exposing their inner self to a public. that does not think about, the fact that you get re-traumatized by telling the story and so on. So I think we owe, of course, a lot to the survivors, but they also did something they did not through their biography. They made this sort of like, they brought us closer to the history. And of course, this is getting, it's 100 years, 90 years, 80 years. It's a longer and longer period of time that we need to sort of bridge. But at the same time, they did something which I think a lot of people did appreciate a lot, or do appreciate a lot. What they presented was very subjective, was radically subjective, their own story, their own perspective. And what we try to do with art is to bring in this very subjective point of view and combine it with the academic overall historical narrative. So we did a couple of exhibitions, and this was one example a couple of years ago, and sort of like the biggest so far, by bringing in artists that would talk about the history of violence in different contexts, in the German context, but also, for example, here, Michal Baron in the Israeli context, or also in other international sort of contexts. On the right-hand side, you see, for example, a work by Idessa Hendeles, a daughter of Holocaust survivors, who did an amazing work that we realized for this exhibition, not in our center, but in a nearby church. And then also other artists that talk about racism and anti-Semitism in today's situation. What we want to do with these exhibitions and the other work that we're doing is we want to open a space for discourse. We want to open a space for debate, because we are, unlike the former, like the concentration camp memorial sites, we are less a space of mourning than a space of debate. People did not die here, where our center is located, but this is a place where incredible violence and incredible suffering was envisioned, and then from here realized. So we try to do many formats, such as podcasts or evening events and so on, to reach out to different audiences. And one of them is, of course, also issues like, very basic, like corporate design. What kind of message do we want to share with the people here in Munich and beyond? And then there is another project that we are right now working on, and it's also a little bit, of course, connected to the pandemic, which had forced us into lockdowns and into the digital space. So we did a lot of, basically learning of the digital space. And one of the things we're right now preparing is a second location in a former forced labor camp, and I can show you some images here on the next slide. You see on the left, this is one of the images taken in this former forced labor camp, and on the right there is the architectural plan for renovating it, and you can see sort of like on the right hand side there's this little basically the space where you see the little dark trees. This is the former forced labor camp. It's 10 barracks. It was not a concentration camp. It was a place where non-Jewish forced laborers from the Netherlands, from France, from Poland, the Soviet Union were brought to. They had to work for the railway. People did not die here in huge numbers. They had fairly okay, not too bad living standards. So especially the Dutch and French workers, Polish and Russian workers, Ukrainian workers' situation was less good. This camp still exists, or sort of the ensemble of the barracks still exists, because local artists have been starting to use it decades ago, so it's still there, and they will remain there. We will be using only 2 of the barracks. The other barracks will be used by these local artists and by children's and youth institutions. And that is, of course, a big challenge because on the one hand, we want it to be a space of memory and history. At the same time, it will be a space of sort of actual people working there. We're right now working on the exhibition, and it will be open in 2 years from now. And here is a link if anybody is interested. This was a digital exhibition we did a couple of years ago during COVID in order to prepare this this project, and it gives an idea of sort of what we want to do there. It was again a project to which we invited contemporary artists to participate. So there was, for example, one photographer from Munich. She traveled with us to a little village near Kiev. That was before the war broke out. And this village is especially interesting for us because the whole village was brought to Germany to do forced labor. So from the children to the elderly, everybody was brought here and they had to work here. The village, of course, became also under siege during the war now. So some of the families, the children of the survivors came to Munich throughout the last couple of years as refugees. This is one of the examples. Another example is an Israeli artist did photos of locations here in Munich because there were 400 living spaces, lodgings of forced laborers throughout the city, because altogether in Germany at that time there were 13 million forced laborers. And this is apart from the concentration camps. It's apart from Jewish forced labor. These were non-Jewish civilian forced laborers who throughout the war were brought here. And their story for a long period of time has remained untold. And this is an opportunity to tell this story in the connection of this space that we are developing right now.
And it's amazing, Miriam, when we speak about the tapestry, you know, that you're showing us that there are stories that were not told yet. And we think 80, 90 years later, and yet there are many stories that were not told, that we are still needing to tell. And how do we tell? How do we remember? How do we collect testimonies? How do we create new museums or new spaces of education? So this is still our task for the next years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, Tali, this is really important what you're saying, because of course the Holocaust and National Socialism, I think, is one of the subjects that is best researched ever. Yes. But there are so many topics which are still, so many stories which are still, you know, we don't know, or they have not been told yet. For example, the whole story of prostitutes, the so-called asocials, of, you know, work nomads at that time, or people who were homeless, who have become victims. Or, for example, also the persecution of queers. We did this exhibition on their history, persecution, but also their history before, because, of course, one of the things that happened, you know, that the regime did is that it successfully made us forget about a lot of these groups. And we've seen that, you know, also with Jewish history. It took a long time until Jewish history re-entered a German public space. Holocaust history came even before, but to see Jewish history as part of German history, or to see the history of queers as part of German history, or to tell the history, for example, of people who became victims of the euthanasia programs. So there's many blank spots that are still there.
Absolutely. And I think the forced laborers is really a good example about what happens where there is silence, and sometimes it comes with shame, not wanting to speak about it, but these topics have to be spoken about. And you write quite a lot about issues of memory and how are issues of memory, you know, reflected on around the world. And I know, Miriam, that there is congratulations at hand, because a new book just came out a few weeks ago. Maybe you can share a little bit about that book as well.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do so. Just an image of the book which just came out. It's not been translated to English yet. Hopefully, it will be. It is a collection of essays, which on one hand is a little bit personal because it starts with sort of my history of why I started to engage with or how I grew up, and what are the interesting conversations that we should have right now, because I've been thinking a lot about this development of the history of memory here in the German-speaking parts of Europe, because on the one hand, this has been taken a lot of time, and today we talk a lot. Germany prides itself to have a very special German memory culture, and American journalists are coming and want to see the sites here, and they want to learn from German memory culture. And I started, by reflecting on what actually is this German memory culture and what is German about it. And if you think about where the memory started, and I can, I'm going to stop now the sharing. So you've seen the images, that's enough. The question, where did the memory of the Holocaust and the Nazi genocide start? It actually did not start in Germany. It started, for example, in Amsterdam, where Alfred Wiener, as a refugee, started collecting stories of German Jews who have become refugees. And he then moved on, because of the war, to London and opened the Wiener Library as one of the important centers and very active centers until today that has a huge archive on the history of the people who became refugees. And the Wiener Library was also an interesting institution, as interesting or important institution, as Ari Joskovich has shown in his new book, because they were the first one who started interviewing Roma survivors, because they said, who will tell their story? So why not us? So it started in Amsterdam and in London that people told their stories, but it also started in Warsaw, where right now we're having an exhibition of the Ringelblum archive, the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, where around, people around Emanuel Ringelblum, 60, 70 people who started collecting the stories of Polish Jewry, and then the stories of the ghetto itself, and then the stories of the Holocaust as it happened. The first maps of Treblinka, of Majdanek, were being collected there, and people knew very well what was going on, and they felt that nobody will tell their stories, so they had to tell the story by themselves. And also the German memory culture, it started in DP camps, in displaced persons camps here in Bavaria, in the American zone. Many Jewish survivors started to interview each other and produced content that then was used in the first, in the Nuremberg trials and in other trials. So what I try to say with these stories, that we tend to nationalize our memory cultures, but often they are transnational projects inherently, because people become refugees, they become survivors, they return from somewhere, they bring their stories with them. So it's always a shared product. But memory is often seen sort of in a national context. And then we tend to forget who contributed, who was actually the author, who was the protagonist of that story. So that's the one aspect of the book. The other aspect is the question of how institutions worldwide that are dealing with the history of violence, how do they influence each other? And there was of course this the tendency in the 1990s that the Holocaust became a global memory. Holocaust Memorial Day, January 27, became, the UN decided that it would become a global sort of like memory, as the Holocaust is a very sort of, a genocide which is exceptional and which is very important for many contexts to understand the history of violence, and it's this sort of also exceptional in the way that it has been told in many ways, that survivors have been telling their stories, that museums have been built. So it also became an example for other stories to tell. For example, and I started traveling, or I have been traveling like we all do, and seen many sites of the history of violence. And I've seen that often the wish is to model a museum or a site that talks about a different incident, to model it according to a Holocaust museum, because this is kind of like the international language of telling a story of violence. So, for example, you exhibit shoes or you exhibit clothes, and this is not only in, for example, in Washington, D.C., but also in Korea, when the story of the comfort women is being told. And when I asked, for example, the director of this museum why she chose this kind of aesthetic representation, she said, yeah, because this is the language we speak when we speak about the history of violence. This is the language that Holocaust museums developed, and this is where we learn.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I mean, I do hope that your book will be translated very, very soon, because, of course, I'm thinking about an amazing, very impactful exhibition in Srebrenica in Bosnia-Herzegovina that uses the symbol of shoes for all the men, you know, that were murdered, men and boys, but also the women. And I'm thinking about many of the development in Germany itself, the new documentation center that just opened 4 or 5 weeks ago in what we in the West called Eagle's Nest, but Obersalzberg, the Berghof, where Hitler's summer house was. A lot of the decisions were down there. And it is still developing, which is amazing. And your book is giving us a depth of looking into all those issues, which are interesting, Miriam.
I think, you know, why I also wanted to ask the question why, and in what ways. Of course, the memory of violence is always contested. It's always complicated. It's never easy. And there are many examples in which we see how, of course, also right-wing populism is using and abusing these memory wars that are happening in the United States, but also, for example, in Poland, where hopefully the situation will be changing now after the election, but where, first of all, most of the historical museums, and especially the memorial sites, got new directors, which were aligned to a new memory policy that would, for example, you know, because there were many Polish victims in World War II, no doubt, but that would highlight them and sort of like put them in the first spot and kind of like, you know, take the kind of like leave the central space to the Polish victims more than to the Jewish victims, and to kind of like nationalize one's own history, to say like, okay, there's Polish victims, Polish Christian victims, and there's Jewish victims who only sometimes appear to be Polish as well. Or these stories, or for example, that it's not allowed, or it was not allowed by law to talk about collaboration anymore. And suddenly Holocaust historians saw themselves, you know, in court because they were raising these issues. So there are many fights being fought on memory, but also I think there are many different approaches. For example, from the German or European point of view, historians would often say, well, Japan has a very problematic memory culture because it does not reflect on its responsibility in the imperial war, that Japan sort of like was occupying basically all of Asia and you know, forcing people into all sorts of situations, forced labor and so on. And that is true. But on the other hand, there is also in Japan, there is, of course, also the history of Hiroshima and a network of more than 60 peace museums who developed out of this history of being a perpetrator and then having become a victim, this whole story of, oh yeah, what we need is peace. So there is peace museums, and you can say like, well, you know, it's easy to talk about peace, but some of them are doing incredible work. And for example, you know, school kids come there, and the first thing they hear is that Japan was responsible for 20 million deaths in this Pacific War. And this is something that you would not hear often in Germany, although we have this very elaborate memory culture, but you would not come to a site like ours and then hear, oh, well, you know, Germany caused a war that eventually had 60 million deaths. So there is very different attempts, and it's hard to say which is the best way to do it. There are just different ways. And what I'm suggesting with this book is that we learn a little bit more from each other, that we look at the way we do things, you know, in Chile, in Johannesburg, in Berlin, in Tokyo, in Washington, and so on, and reflect what we learn, or, you know, what we could also criticize, and in which ways collaborations could help us develop a new form of thinking about the past, which is less, you know, sort of, you know, home in nationalist.
So that is wonderful point to go to my last two questions, and maybe we can combine them, about the importance of learning from each other. As you said, we had the honor to host you at our center here in Johannesburg and learn about the fantastic work you do in Munich. And I had the great pleasure of being in your documentation center and indeed meet people from Chile and from the United States and from Spain and from South America and so on. So what is the importance of partnerships? And in this very difficult world of ours, full of war, from Europe to Israel and the Middle East to Africa, a space of many wars, Somalia, Ethiopia, Darfur again, and so on, and Myanmar, in Southeast Asia, and so on. What is the importance of partnership, and where do we go? What is the way forward for museums, memorials, memory of the Holocaust, of violence in our world going forward? Difficult questions, but let's reflect on that, Miriam.
Yeah. It's difficult questions, and there's a lot you can say about it too, of course. I think, you know, I started thinking about collaborations when, for example, I read, you know, American journalists coming to Germany, wanting to understand what is happening in Germany, because when the discussion on Confederate monuments started in the US, someone said, oh, let's look at the Germans. What did they do with the Hitler statues? And then, of course, there are no Hitler statues, because we had the Allies and we had the Potsdam Conference that said, okay, let's get rid of everything. Let's get rid of all that. And maybe, you know, there's some even American army museums that would house some of these remnants, but most of the things were destroyed and gone. You cannot find them anymore. And so we profited a lot from this international sort of like demands. And then journalists would come and they would want to understand, because the US are struggling themselves a lot with how to tell one's own history of violence. The US has a network of Jewish and Holocaust museums, thanks to survivors who started that. You know, the first Holocaust Museum in Skokie, Illinois, started as an initiative by survivors in the 1970s, sort of a very small space. When there was a neo-Nazi rally in Skokie, it was scheduled, and then the survivors, you know, formed an alliance with others, non-Jewish Americans, and this was the base for a Holocaust museum, and many other Holocaust museums started like this. But then again, the United States has, you know, is struggling with its own history of violence. So there was no museum on the history of slavery until 2014, when the Whitney Plantation Museum was opened as an entirely private initiative. So it was not a federal or state initiative, and so is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. So American journalists came to Germany, and then they looked at Germany and they're like, oh yeah, there is a great network of institutions. There is this whole educational system, it's really functioning very well. But then they said, lots of things you've done well, but what about family histories? Did you talk about these issues in the families? And this is one of the weak points of Germany, like really that this is something that has been missed also because there were state institutions, but for many other reasons, because people didn't want to talk for a long period of time. And only now they are asking. And so, by looking at each other's narratives, by learning from each other, we see also what are our blank spots and where did we do things well, or someone else did it completely different or in a different way. And of course, institutions, you've mentioned, for example, Chile. Chile has this wonderful Museo de la Memoria, which I haven't visited yet, but I would love to, who do a lot of participative work, a lot of sort of like, working through trauma, working through the grief that is still there on the history of a dictatorship, which is not that long ago. And that really helps us and enables us to learn from each other's practices, but also to see where we do need support. Like, for example, when in Poland, when museums have become under pressure, or we're not free to tell this narrative anymore that they wanted to tell, or for example, in Spain now, where there's a lot of fights on how to tell this history. And that is one of the hopes that we have, or we see that there is so much that we can learn from each other. Also from your center, for example, when you said like, this is, the history of survivors, the history of refugees who came to Johannesburg, but then also to think, oh, what is the relevance for the people living here today? We have to tell the story of Rwanda and the refugees who came and brought their stories with them, because we all experience these traumas. And, in Germany today, there is finally, we're talking about, the history after 1945. People who came here, maybe they have experienced World War II outside of Europe or in a different part of Europe, and they bring their stories with them. Jews from the Soviet Union who came in the 1990s, or other people who have probably experienced the war in North Africa, for example, or in other parts of Africa and have become, Senegal, they were the French battalions and have their own stories to tell. This we have to include. This is part of our narrative. And also the wars that happened afterwards, because of course, outside of Europe, the war did not end. So there were many wars in many countries of the world, but even in Europe. And this is largely forgotten. So when the war in Ukraine broke out, everybody here in Germany and really sort of major media outlets said, this is the first war in Europe since 1945. But of course, there was a war in Yugoslavia and there was a genocide in Bosnia. And these people came as refugees. They told their stories. And it was really interesting to see that only now, and with the war in Ukraine and now in Israel, people start to tell more of their stories. And it's kind of like we have to continue writing this history of violence and this memory of violence to make it relevant for people, to keep it relevant for the people living here. And I do not think that telling more recent stories would weaken Holocaust memory. On the contrary, I see that people feel like, because we have to ask ourselves, who will carry this memory in the future? And then it's, of course, the people who feel that it is relevant for them. And if somebody escaped the genocide in Srebrenica and came here and tells their story, they feel that they're part of a larger project of memory, and they will tell other stories too. So they will see that there is a relevance also to other memories, to Holocaust memory, to memory of forced laborers and so on.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts that are really opening a lot of doors of I would say the urgency of working today, working with stories, working with experiences, looking at stories that were not told and making connections to today's world. So Miriam, Dr. Miriam Zadov, may I just say a huge thank you for sharing your time with us, your vast experience, both from academia and from your practice as a memory activist, I would call you. And it is always a pleasure to work with you and cooperate with you and partner with you. And for the Classroom Without Borders, in partnership with many, many other institutions. And for all our audiences, I think you enriched our experience in this series of Tapestry. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me. And let me extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's traveling to Europe and may have a chance to stop in Munich. Please do contact me and do stop by. We're always really interested in enriching our conversations through perspectives that come from outside, from a different world, from different experiences. We learn a lot. Thank you so much, Tali, for having me.
Thank you.
Just give us one moment while we close out the video and highlight Tali, who will say some closing remarks before I formally close this out for today.
Thank you. And you can see with the same clothes, the interview happened only a few hours ago. And it closes a very, very interesting series that started early this year, a brainchild of our friend Esther Finder, Toprak Finder, my friend and colleague from the generation of the Shoah International, that brought that idea a while back, that wouldn't it be interesting to look at the Holocaust and how it links to so many disciplines? It was a pleasure really to look at issues of education and doctors and psychiatry and Jewish studies and gender studies and law and order and the police and other intersections into this series. All of them are recorded. You can listen or share those recordings with others, because I think that we learned so much through this fantastic series. And it was a pleasure to end the series with the issue of memory. I myself, of course, founded the center in Johannesburg, but I find that the issue of memory, museum, memorials, that started immediately, as Miriam said, even during the Holocaust, we started to look at how do we remember what is happening, from the Vienna Library and refugees to Oneg Shabbat and the Ringelblum archive in Warsaw, and into post-Holocaust memory, such as opening of the Auschwitz memorial site already in 1947, also by survivors, and then so many sites. The Association of Holocaust Organizations today have more than 300 partner organizations, and that is museums, it's memorials, it's university departments that are dealing with it, and so much more. And that is now working so closely with other memory sites around the world, sites of violence, university departments, and more. And this is our challenge for the future. And as we watch with such concern rising anti-Semitism, rising in hate speech, rising in othering, and vicious attacks and violence rising again, the question to us, memorials, museums, practitioners of memory, of and educators, is how do we teach it in today's world? Do we teach the same? Do we teach it differently? And those strategies and thoughts are very, very much in our hearts and minds as we navigate the current situation in the months to come. And with that, I would love to thank all the partners, and to you, the audience, and of course to you, Classroom Without Borders, for hosting this wonderful series. Ellen,
back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tali. I would like to express our appreciation to Tali and Miriam for today's event. I will echo all of Tali's comments about this entire series. It has been transformative. The content that we've presented here, the scholarship that we've shared with you really has given a new lens to an understanding of Holocaust studies. I also would like to formally thank our partners for this series, of course, Tali Nates and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Maydeen Shahar, Director of the Talking Memory online lecture series and international education programs at the Ghetto Fighters House, Esther Topurik-Finder, member of GSI Coordinating Council, Generations of the Shoah and Liberation 75. As we navigate these trying moments, we remain committed to staying informed and connected. For those of you that will be celebrating this coming Thanksgiving holiday, hold your loved one close and pray for peace. We extend our gratitude to all of you for your active participation and support. Together, we can work towards building bridges and understanding and empathy through these testing times. As always, if you'd like to help us support our mission, please visit our website to donate online. We are hopeful for the coming of a new year. We will meet in peace and unity. Thank you, everyone. Bye.